start. 2, 1.
There's nothing like being in space to do an experiment about space. There's room and opportunity for scientists of all sizes, shapes, and ages to do this. They really should.
Welcome back to Skyward, the podcast that brings you behind the scenes of the aviation and aerospace industry. I'm your host, Pilot Mercedes, and today we're joined by a very distinguished Dr. Robert Ferl, professor at the University of Florida, and not to mention a trailblazing first-time NASA-funded scientist who conducted experiments in space.
The captain has turned on the seatbelt light. Please take your seat and fasten your seatbelts. Thank you.
Rob, thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to talk about this stuff anytime.
Amazing. Well, let's dive right into it. What early moments in your life first ignited your fascination with flight, space, and how did those shape your dream of becoming a jet pilot and engineer?
So, yeah, that's a very, very fair question. And I'm old enough to have grown up in the era when Saturday morning cartoons came on only when the TV stations started to broadcast. And they would broadcast at the beginning of Saturday morning cartoons for us, the Star-Spangled Banner and jets flying over the flag. So as a kid, I have to tell you that kind of imagery is the kind of thing that set the stage for why I might be interested in flight or flying. I also grew up in a small town in northern Ohio, so the local airport and the few planes that were there were a big part of my kiddom, if you will.
Right.
So yeah, the inspiration for flying, the inspiration for thinking about space and being up in the air, all came from looking up at the sky, whether it was at night or during the day or on those early morning cartoon commercials as the TV stations got spun up.
So you had inspiration all around you, kind of encouraging you, per se, in this direction.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
All right. And then your grandmother, parents, and teachers were really big cheerleaders of your curiosity. Can you share a specific memory of how their encouragement steered you toward a life in science and aviation?
Well, let's explore that, because I do think that I grew up in an era and in a family where education was sort of everything, and not just because going to school and getting degrees or getting grades or anything like that was the thing. The thing was to be engaged with your mind, to think, to wonder. So we grew up as kids in an atmosphere that was all about how do things work? How do we take things apart? How do we understand how they function? How do we think about what is driving, making, or allowing things to happen in our world? So the notion of wonderment and just sort of that native curiosity, came from my parents, came from my grandmother in particular. She was a reporter for the local newspaper. She was also a local pilot. She was also,
Wow.
and she was
That's really cool.
she was also one of those people, one of those grandmothers that would take us kids on adventures. So we'd go pound around the creeks or around the woods and pick up rocks and look what was underneath there, and do that in a way that was basically unafraid. Being curious and wondering about things was not something to be embarrassed about. It was something to celebrate. It was something to talk about then at the dinner table or at any point in time. To bring a bug or to bring a stick of a certain kind of thing or a rock with a fossil in it, anything like that
That's
was
fantastic.
was encouraged. And the notion that anybody could do anything, if my grandmother could learn to fly, my goodness, sorry, but anybody could learn to fly. So we were brought up as curious kids that absolutely thought we could do whatever we wanted.
That is an amazing environment to grow up in and community to just be able to explore the world and ask questions about everything. So that is
Yeah,
just so amazing. I'd love to ask a little bit about your grandmother. So she was a pilot as well as you said worked in the newspaper.
yeah.
What drew her Do you know what drew her to aviation and that kind of sense of curiosity?
I I think you just hit on it, and that is she was one of those people that basically thought, I wonder what that's like. Um,
Yeah.
why can I not? Why ought to? Actually, maybe I should have that experience. Um, I'd like to drive a car. I'd like to drive a car fast. I'd like to learn how to bowl. I'd like to learn how to hit a golf ball. I'd like to learn how to fly. This was just the way she thought and worked. And that led a lot into the family dynamic with regard to always doing something, learning something new, especially, and maybe even learning something challenging.
Hmm. I think you and me and your grandmother would have gotten along very well. She sounds amazing.
She was, and I absolutely, still to this day, wish I could swing a golf club as well as she could. Um,
Oh man.
yeah,
She kept the bar high. She started your bar really high right out of the gate.
yep, yep. And you mentioned teachers and other things like that.
Yeah.
Um, Again, I grew up in an era where access to science was just coming on. With Sputnik
Mm,
had taken off, science was getting to be a big deal. We were talking about putting people into space. That pulled a lot of us people, especially us curious people, towards
yeah.
science and towards engineering. And the notion that you could go to school and learn stuff that had to do with what you were seeing on TV about going to space was the kind of thing that tied in all that sort of droll, troublesome, gotta go to schoolness and turned it
Mhm.
into, oh man, I get to go to school because if I go to school, I can learn how those people got into space. I can know how a rocket works. I might even be able to figure out what life is like on another planet. These are the kinds of things that were enabled by, a school system and a family life and the other kinds of things
Mhm.
that really treasured that wondering about what's up there. Yeah, I mean, my goodness, I remember distinctly going out in the backyard looking for Sputnik. I mean, holy cow.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. We would go out and
That's amazing.
look for satellites once more of them got up there because my goodness, they were up there. They moved. There weren't that many planes in the air at night in those days.
Right.
And it was the kind of thing that again fostered that curiosity that said, I can go learn about that stuff.
Oh, that's just amazing. So you had your grandmother, you had teachers, you had that learning environment, like just in the community, as well as the culture of the new age of science. So you had it all around you that you had people that wanted to learn similar things as you, even in your peers, as well as your mentors. So that is a really great start. That was
Yeah,
really cool.
I always look back on my childhood days as truly, I mean, as for all of us, but formative
Mhm.
in the way that encouraged us as kids, me in particular, as I look back to be inquisitive and to not be afraid to ask
Mhm.
questions. Golly, that's very cool, and everybody should experience that.
I agree. I fully agree. So, what were your parents' endeavors? Because we talked about your grandmother, your teachers you mentioned were really big part of moving you forward in your curiosity and figuring out what path for you to take. What were your parents' kind of role in that path?
So my dad worked on the railroad, and my mom was a nurse. So first things first, everything takes work.
Mhm.
If you're gonna succeed, you gotta work, and so we absolutely understood that. The other thing that was very clear for us kids from the start was that we would go to school. Not only go to
Mm.
school, but we would go to college as well, that we would use what gifts we had to get beyond the little town we grew up in. I don't
Mm.
mean to make it so sort of movie-esque or anything, but the idea that we would get up, study, go to school, and get,
Mhm.
a broader sense of the world than in our little town, yeah,
Mhm.
that was a family thing that my parents absolutely instilled and encouraged, and again, I credit them for basically convincing me that, well, I could do anything.
With hard work, you can do anything. That is honestly one of the best lessons to learn because the sooner you're able to learn that, the world is just full of possibilities. There's always
Absolutely.
challenges, but with enough perseverance and determination and hard work,
Yep.
you will get rewarded for those efforts, which I'm sure we will get into a little bit more. So, you also initially dreamed of engineering and piloting jets, but professors guided you towards science, correct? And then
Well,
what was that pivot like, and
so,
how did it redefine you?
um, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not necessarily considering that a pivot. Um,
Okay.
the the idea that one could study engineering, idea that one could study science, um, was was again something that for sort of both of those endeavors, the engineering
Mhm.
side or the science side, the idea of figuring stuff out, of taking things apart, as I mentioned before, of my dad, who was besides working on the railroad, was a builder. He understood how things fit together, how things can be taken apart, how things can be invented in order to make something work.
Mm,
These are all sort of attributes I would lump together. And so the scientist and engineer are sort of all sort of part of the same um, sort of
same line.
spectrum. Yeah, spectrum
Yeah.
in terms of the way one thinks. It's problem solving, it's figuring out, it's wondering why or how things work.
Mhm.
And that's what drove me, and that's what drove me from sort of getting an undergraduate degree in science to actually becoming a scientist. Because when I figured out that I could go to school for 4 more years and I could get to study more cool stuff and actually get involved in teaching other people and, well, get paid for it. Um, I, how cool is that?
That is
I get
amazing.
to go to school for 4 more years, get another degree, and get paid for it? Sign me up.
And then you get to share that you've been able to share that curiosity with the next generation over
Oh
and over.
oh, right on. I mean, both my wife and I, absolutely enjoy living in a university town because it's full of kids that are curious, that wanna learn, that want to experience new things. Helps keep us young, helps keep us thinking, it helps
Mhm.
sort of reinvigorate that notion of curiosity and wonderment because we get to live it every year.
which is truly a blessing that you guys get to live in the environment that you you worked hard for, but that also aligned with your dreams. Like, that's just an amazing blessing. So, out of curiosity of your wife, because you've brought her up, what does she do? You both work in science, if I remember correctly.
That's right. Yeah, she is one of those Renaissance people. Her undergraduate degree was in history, her master's and other degrees tend towards science. And for her science career, she worked as a paleontologist at the Florida Museum of Natural History. So
That is
she
very cool.
so she studied, yeah, the very distant past and helped dig fossils and think things up with regard to the way life has changed over the
Mhm.
eons. Whereas I tend to think about how life might change if we move it off the surface of the earth.
But it's very complementary because you can't have the future without the past, and the past helps you look forward to the future. So
Right.
it seems very complementary to both of your careers are very complementary to one another, but very different.
They are different. We like to think that they're complementary, but certainly they allow us to keep a broad perspective in
Mm.
what we do.
Has there ever been a conversation that you ended up having where you were trying to problem solve something that having a separate perspective helped you rethink the problem?
Oh my goodness, yes, of course. Um, I'd almost say, "Well, duh. Yeah, of course. That's what we
Do you have a
do."
possible story or example to
N um,
I'm sure you have many.
yeah, and so I would say that it's sorta hard to pick out a particular one, but certainly my wife, Mary B, um, has also the more artistic and
Hmm,
sort of intuition side of the world figured out better than me. So when I need
okay.
so when I need an impression of a
Mhm.
situation or a person or even a thing in the science world, I'll ask her because her thin slice, her first cut of things is one that's based on some incredible intuition, whereas I tend to dig into the details and
Yeah,
try to figure it out with numbers. She can intuit much of that kind of stuff.
that is really cool. It's just really cool to see science in 2 different ways that they're still both science, but you have 2 different personalities that are able to go into it and bring a different perspective to it.
Yep.
Uh, it's amazing. I love it. So when did your passion for aviation and space transform into a concrete professional pursuit?
That is really an excellent question, and it'll take me a little while to unspool it
Well, we
um,
have time.
because because 2 things sorta happened, um, in parallel. One was my own flying, um, endeavors, and the other was my science endeavors. Um, I I got really interested in how life adapts to changes in its environment. So how do we cope? How do we as people,
Mhm.
how do we as plants, how do we as bacteria cope with a change in our environment? And for the longest time, that sort of environmental change might be it's too hot or it's too cold, and we need to understand what happens when a disease comes in and does something to us that causes our cells um, to mount a response, to adapt, to become something different or become something metabolically different in order to survive or even thrive in that new environment. So I was working away
Mhm.
at that as sort of my science gig, um, and my desires to fly sort of set in the background for a while. I didn't become a pilot until my son graduated from high school. And again, my wife, the intuitive person, understood that I would need something to do, need something to fill the void, if you will. And
Yeah.
she reminded me that you might have time to learn to fly now. And so she bought the first lessons, she made it all happen, and that's how I became a pilot sort of in midlife as opposed to as a younger person. So that was happening on that thing. Also during that time, sort of that inflection point, in my science career, again, being at the University of Florida, not too
Mhm.
far from Kennedy Space Center, where launches of the space shuttle in the 1990s especially, began to
Oh.
do science in space. There were space shuttle missions
Huh.
that were dedicated to science, not just getting out there and coming back. There were entire laboratories that were taken to space in the space shuttle and brought.
Wow.
And I began to learn that there were people that actually studied stuff that went to space in the space shuttle and came back.
Huh.
You mean I can take my science and now try to understand is not just what happens when we get hot or cold, but what happens when we go into space. My
Yeah.
my goodness, all of our evolutionary preparedness is to live in one gravity here on the Earth,
Mhm.
underneath a gorgeous atmosphere, protected by the Van Allen belts from radiation and all the kinds of things that allow us to be the organisms that we are, is because we're here.
Right.
What gives us the notion, the idea, the sort of the chutzpah to think, "Yeah, we can live anywhere. We can live on the moon. You know, we can do well in space." What makes us think like that?
Yeah.
So then in the middle '80s, or excuse me, in the middle '90s, and especially towards the end of the '90s, more and more science was going to space, and the opportunity for scientists to propose work to go into space um, became more of a quote pivot that you mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
where the kind of science that I was doing and the kinds of things that I was doing inside cells of terrestrial organisms could then be asked within the space environment. We could now treat going to space like another environment that we need to understand. And my goodness, if we are going to live and work in space for long periods of time, especially, we should know what happens to our bodies. We should know what happens to
Yeah.
bacteria. We should know what happens to our terrestrial life if we're gonna take it to another world, if we're gonna take it to space, if we're gonna take it to places where there's no
Absolutely.
gravity, we should understand that stuff. And that's where my science career and my love of space and flying began to weave together into that sort of highly directed career path that took me into space science full time.
That and do you mind telling what was your specific experiment that you ended up taking up to space eventually? What give me all the science that was involved. And I'll try and keep up.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and happy to share. Um, I'm what's called a molecular biologist. I study what goes on with the DNA and the RNA and the other molecules inside of living cells that
Right.
direct their metabolism to grow, to shrink, to become a different color, to sprout leaves, or to lose hair or whatever. So I look
Hmm.
at those genetic controls of what's going on inside an organism. One of the things that ended up being something that allowed me to go to space is the following observation. Over the past decades, we, the scientific community, we people that think we know all kinds of things have learned an awful lot about what it's like to live in space compared to living on the ground. We've gotten pretty good at that. But there's almost no experiments that have ever been done on the way to space. Think about in the space shuttle
Huh.
era or in the Apollo era. Think about astronauts going to space with helmets on and big gloves and pressure suits. There's no way they're doing an experiment on their way to space. They don't
No.
even get out of their suits or reconfigure their capsule until they've been in space for a long time. And already a lot of changes in my world, in my molecular biology world, would have happened by then.
Mm-hmm.
So while we know a lot about living in space and compared to living on the ground, we don't know that much about what happens in the first few minutes, the first few seconds even, of going into space. What happens as soon as the rocket stops the high G ascent and you're floating? How soon does your body respond? How soon does the cells of a plant respond? How does those first few seconds and minutes in space compared to being in space for a long time? What I
Mm-hmm.
got to do, because the Blue Origin New Shepard capsule is a shirt sleeve environment, you don't have to wear helmets, you don't have to wear gloves. I was
Oh, wow.
allowed, I,
Okay, I didn't know that.
yeah, I was enabled to do the first experiments on the molecular biology of adaptation to space um, in that capsule on that ride. We took blood from me before and after, and I took samples at various stages during the flight to understand what happens to the organisms that we're studying on the way to
Mm-hmm.
space. So we get to, for the first time now, be able to ask questions about that entry time into space. Whereas before, as I mentioned, the astronauts would have to reconfigure their vehicle. They'd have to get out of their pressure suits and all that kind of
Right.
stuff. And in my world, that's a long time
And
from
by that time, change has already happened. The
you
impact
got
has
it.
already happened.
Yep. Yep.
So you're just seeing the before, the after, but you're not seeing the actual change or the actual impact.
Exactly. Yes, you're very right.
Yeah, so how long is it? So you've experienced the unique sensation of flying 90 degrees straight up into space, transitioning from atmosphere to weightlessness, as you just talked about with your experiment. What was it like experiencing those G's?
So the boy, we could talk for hours just on the experience of flying to space.
Well, and then how did it compare to your years of flying planes? Because you have had extensive experience of flying in planes as a passenger, as a scientist, and
Yep.
then as a pilot by that point.
Yeah. So you already mentioned one of the dramatic differences, and that is going very literally straight up is not something we do in airplanes. Um,
No.
I've
Well, okay, maybe aerobatics.
and only for a short time.
Yes.
Um, and under sort of one of the things that is just burned into my memory on the ascent to space is going through a cloud layer. All of us pilots have gone through a cloud layer. You
Mhm.
see it, you get in, and you watch it go up, and you watch the clouds go by sideways as you're going through. And when you break out on top, and the clouds are rushing by below, they're just a few feet away. You know you're moving. You've got that horizontal vector to your climb that says very definitely, I'm in an airfoil that's moving forward. When you're in a
Mhm.
rocket, you just go straight up. It's like being in an elevator. You're looking out this
Huh.
you're looking out this big window, and everything is just going straight down. The
Right.
clouds are not moving sideways. They're just down below you now. You're
Yeah.
not you're not you're not there's no horizontal vector to to
Mhm.
to to give you a frame of reference. And I still look back at that as one of the sort of not disquieting, but sort of disorienting things about the flight to space. It is so dang vertical.
Yeah.
3.5 minutes straight up, going faster than the speed of sound and thousands of miles an hour by the time you get up there. And it's all straight up. All the G vectors are going just, we're in couches, so it's not pooling in your feet. You're sort of laying down to a certain extent, and all the G vectors are straight back through your cheeks.
Wow.
And it is just so directly up. That's the first thing. The second thing I have to tell you about with regard to riding a rocket is that it was incredibly smooth and the start was gentle.
Huh.
So you know what it's like. You push the power lever forward and you start getting moving back. You know the G's are happening. This rocket starts out at speed 0 and very,
Right.
very slowly builds up vertical speed. So the first few feet off the ground, it's not like sitting in your car and pushing the pedal down. It's just like
Right.
levitating off the surface of the earth. And then things start moving a little quicker and you start feeling the velocity. But at the beginning, it's just like, I don't know, riding in a smooth elevator with glass walls.
Wow. That was not the explanation I was thinking you were going to give at all. 'Cause I mean, definitely not myself, and most people have never experienced that kind of from the ground up, literally all the way into weightless space.
Yep.
So that is I thought it would be more jarring right out of the gate because of the thrust of the power of the thrusters and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so on this particular rocket, which is a very smooth rocket, and it's a heavy rocket, so if there's any sideways momentum from wind or anything else like that, it's sort of buffered by the mass of the rocket that is working its way straight up. It's not a
Interesting.
lot of jiggling and not a lot of shaking or anything else like that, but there's a lot of rumbling, and
Right?
you can hear it going, but the sense of speed going up is not a result of an immediate G-force that hits you in the back. It's more a slow buildup
Huh.
that ends up, and you look up at the little instrument screen, and all of a sudden it says you're going 3,500 miles an hour, and you go, "What? Are you kidding me? There's no way."
Wow. So there's no physical correlation between what the meters are saying, instruments are saying, versus the feeling of going up at
Right.
that speed.
Right, and
Interesting.
you mentioned aerobatics, and you mentioned the other kinds of things that we experience as pilots, where
Yep.
your um, inner ear and your proprioceptors are all telling you
Yep.
what's going on or what you think is going on.
But there's no
Those
connection
those
in
are
that
those are
experience.
all missing in that experience.
That I did not expect that at all. That's quite unique. Quite interesting.
It is,
So
and the other thing I just wanna mention before I forget is on the new Shepard capsule, the windows are huge. They are 2 feet wide, 3.5 feet tall, and you are right next to the window. So
wow.
so you
So you
have
get a great view
you have
of
an
the whole experience.
enormously great view. Um, and, I mean, the space shuttle astronauts could look up just a little bit. Many of them were down inside the mid-deck
The
area
capsule.
and had no
Yeah.
windows at all. Um, Even in the Apollo era, they just had little windows pointing straight up.
Yeah. I've
Um,
been to a couple I've been to the Kennedy Space Center and a
yeah,
couple of the windows, I was surprised by how tiny they are. You're controlling this big, massive machine, and you get
yep,
these little windows, and you're going launching into space.
yep, yep,
You're really trusting your instruments and the team that's behind you
yeah.
in order to make that a successful mission. So, that's amazing. And then what was it like going from our atmosphere into space, which we know is very dark? What was it like to transition? And when did you take off? I'm assuming it was daytime.
So our launch occurred at a little after 8 o'clock in the morning, Texas time. So sunrise, basically. So
Okay. Yep.
it was a daytime flight. Um, the speed at which the view out the window goes from blue to black is pretty amazing. Um, any of us that have flown high or even been on a high mountain going skiing, you look straight
Yep.
up and it's purple, right? It starts to get dark. We
Mhm.
know that it's going to get dark. We're conditioned to understand that at some point it will get black. But at that moment when enough of the visual out that big window that I mentioned
Mhm.
begins to sink in, you look down and all the blue is down there, and you look out or up and there is nothing but black, nothing but black.
Wow.
And that's enough to stir your soul, no question.
I bet it would be very strange to see blue down below and not above.
Yep.
That that would be very strange. Very strange indeed. So then how what were the experience that, you took up with you? And obviously you're monitoring during this 3.5 minute experience.
Yeah, 3.5
What
minutes on the way up.
what did you learn from those experiments?
So, I'll do a little bit of science with you in a minute, but one of the things
Okay.
that I have to talk about, is this notion that, boy, and don't take this as sort of goofy as it's gonna sound, but that a plain old person, a regular old scientist, can do an experiment and go to space to do the experiment. That's, I think, one of the biggest things that we accomplished with this flight. The idea that if you're gonna be a scientist, you're gonna be a student, a graduate student or something
Mhm.
like that, it's now possible to propose, to go to school, to learn about space, and part of your summer internship might be to go to space
Which
because
would be the coolest thing ever. I would wanna go back to school just to do that.
yes, we are entering that era where more and more and more people are going to space. And the it's true that most of the people that are going on those kinds of rockets right now are very well-to-do people that can afford to buy this seat, but the price is
Mhm.
coming down, and the notion that you could propose, in my case, to NASA, to buy a seat because there's science worth doing in that
Mhm.
vehicle and be funded to do it. And by the way, there's more people in line now getting ready to go and have their experience and their experiments done during suborbital flights. It really
Amazing.
opens the door to the notion that there's a day when if you're curious enough and want to study space, well, you can go to space and study space. I mean, imagine yourself being an aeronautical engineer that had never been in a plane up in the air. Imagine yourself
Yeah.
being an oceanographer that had never been out to sea. here we are, we've got a generation of scientists that have studied space, studied, in my case, space biology, studied it for decades,
Mhm.
but never been there? What? So so in terms of what we learned, that's one of the things I want to absolutely celebrate, that we learned it can be
Yeah.
done, that a regular person can be trained up to the point where they can do science, still enjoy the flight, still get their stuff done, and you don't have to be, um, 10 years at NASA being an astronaut in order to get to go to space. Um,
Right.
so But getting back to what we have learned that those first few minutes in space are related to, but very different from what happens to us when we adapt for longer term. And so
Hmm.
there are chronic things that astronauts experience that plants and animals and bacteria experience in space that we're beginning to understand. And by looking at these first few minutes in space, we get sort of that initial perspective of what signals those changes that happen.
Mhm.
Sometimes good signals, sometimes not so good signals for what we would like to be a nicely adaptive process for living in space.
Well, those are really interesting. I mean, great that you have this data, and then amazing that you were a trailblazer, the first NASA-funded scientist to go up with your experiment, and now that you have a long list of scientists waiting to just
Right on.
have their turn to have their
Yep.
experiment go up firsthand, rather
Yes.
than having someone else take it up for them.
Right.
It's
Right.
You're right, it's a huge thing to celebrate. It's an amazing thing to celebrate. So then you've also logged 1,500 hours as a pilot. Can you walk through what it was like to achieve that milestone of 1,500 hours with your PPL, your instrument rating, and then ended up with your complex aircraft endorsement, and maybe how that affected your experience before going up into space?
Yeah, boy, there's a fair bit of things to unpack in that kind of question and that kind
Well,
of thinking.
you've accomplished a lot, and I'm sure it connects to a lot of how you thought through different situations and prepared as well. It give
Right.
you new perspective.
So my particular space flight was actually proposed 7 years ago, and it took nearly 6 years for it to happen once it was made available to happen. One of
So it
the
wasn't like a quick thing. It was
Oh,
a lot of work and a lot of time.
yep, yep, and a lot of that occurred, I don't wanna say in secret, but basically in secret because
Mhm.
the, um, the crews for the new Shepard, launches are never announced until just a few weeks ahead of time. So
Right.
we had to develop a whole lot of things and get a whole lot of things figured out operationally about what I could and could not do inside the flight capsule.
Mm.
Um, but very clearly, in the early days when NASA was wondering, golly, can we just send a plain old scientist to space? Are you kidding me? We're really going to do this? Um, the the fact that I had an airman's medical, the fact that I had flight experience, the fact that not only did I have flight experience, but I was a pilot and had other
You
sorts
had
of
prior education and knowledge
Yep,
that a regular well, say regular, that another scientist may not have.
correct. And
Interesting.
would they ask those same questions now, 6.5 years later? I don't think so. But at the time, when NASA and Blue Origin were coming to grips with the idea of you know taking on the responsibility of sending
A
garden variety
civilian?
scientists to space, it helped that that scientist was familiar with FAA regulations, that would
Mm-hmm.
know how to behave in a flight environment, that had conducted experiments on flight lines, that knew how to hang out in a hangar, for goodness sake.
Right.
And just things that and again, people, please don't take this wrong, but normal people don't know how to hang out in a hangar, right? They don't know what you can touch. They don't know what you can't
Right.
touch. They don't know that you shouldn't walk behind certain things or in front of certain things.
Yep.
And I think that my flight experience and the fact that we had worked with other aircraft and other experimental platforms that had to do with spaceflight uh,
Mm-hmm.
gave the whole system, including Blue Origin, but especially NASA, a level of comfort that uh, that I and my group, that we basically knew how to behave, if you will,
Right.
knew how to act
Mm-hmm.
in the flight line environment.
Right. No, that's fair enough because you brought up that you also did other experiments on other aircraft and you've had experience with other experiments with NASA. So you mentioned before that you flew on the C9. Correct me if I'm wrong if I get these if I get these aircraft wrong, and then the KC-135
Right,
to test high G and zero G environments before even going into this possible
right, right.
scenario.
So our laboratory group and the scientists that we sort of hang out with did a lot of both science but also proof of concept work in
Hmm.
these zero G aircraft. I got, I've got, I've got basically almost 4 orbits of the Earth worth of microgravity at 20 seconds at a time. So I've done
Wow. Okay.
thousands of parabolas inside these aircraft. Got started in the C9 flying out of Cleveland at Glenn Research Center, and then also with the KC-135 um, out of Houston. Um, NASA pilots flying NASA airplanes
Hmm.
in these parabolic arcs that allow us to experience um, zero gravity for a fair bit of time, 20 seconds at a time during those flights. Again, I think that sort of flight operations experience helped NASA be comfortable with the fact that I and my group knew how to behave inside those airplanes and in those flight lines. Um, but also, um, just this this is a very wacky flying experience, I have to tell you. Um,
Well, I wanted to ask up on that because you meant it sounds like you guys were just going up and down, up and down, up and down,
yep.
low gravity to high gravity. How high did you have to start in order to begin the experiment?
Well, and again, these are sort of standard protocols, especially back in the NASA era. And the NASA developed the KC-135 to train astronauts and also to understand especially how fluids work in zero gravity. So basically, picture a 707 getting up to altitude, then pulling nose up to 45 degrees up to as high as you can go, pushing the nose over to 45 degrees nose low, and heading
Wow.
straight to the ground.
Oh
And
my
doing
goodness.
that till you get down to, I don't know, 20,000 feet or so, and then start pulling out.
Going back up again?
Yep. And the first flight I did would happen to be as the C9 out of Cleveland. We flew in the morning 69 parabolas. So we did that maneuver
And
69 times, and then
I
went
feel
out and
like you
had
would have been tired after that.
yes. And then we went out and had lunch and did 65 in the afternoon, And it was during the afternoon that I got sick.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
After lunch?
Yes.
So
So,
how long would those flights be if you're trying to do the math here? You do like about 20 seconds downward, but then you have to climb back up. What is that? About 30 minutes to an hour
yeah, about an
or
hour's flying
longer?
time. Yeah. Yep. Because you have to do it in military operating areas. So
Okay.
they can clear the airspace because they basically give you the whole box because you're going up and down and you're going in weird directions
Right.
in order to ensure that you get what we call quality microgravity experience. That means the pilots have to fly straight. They have to understand what gravity they're creating inside the aircraft or not.
Yeah.
They have to account for varying temperature layers and whether or not the wind is going to shift them around. Because if there's too much turbulence, the people that are floating free back in the airplane are going to find themselves on the roof or on the floor or against a wall.
Right. That's so basically every single experiment and every single person on the team had to be very diligent to their role in the
Yes.
experiment, from the pilots to the scientists to everybody involved.
Yep.
You had to do it with the extreme precision. Sorry.
Yep, and mostly, it just as we do as pilots, it's mostly situational awareness of all kinds. How much time is going
Right.
by? Um, what are the clues that are telling you that the plane is getting ready to pull up? Oh, I'm headed towards the floor. Maybe I better be put my put my feet down there. Um,
Yeah.
and these are all things that for either fleeting seconds or even, even longer, we as pilots get back to the fact that we intuit what's going on because
Mhm.
of all the signals that are coming in through our eyes and our ears and our butts and our
Mhm.
feet. We try to keep that situational awareness inside the bubble that is our aircraft.
Right.
We do the same thing inside those big parabolic flight airplanes. We try to keep aware, just as you said.
Mhm. So, and were there specific weather conditions that had to be taken into account before doing this experiment in one of those aircraft?
Yeah, usually back in the sort of the heyday of NASA's Reduced Gravity Program office, we would go to Houston for a week of flying, and we would try to find 4 good days out of that week where we could fly, 100 parabolas, something like that.
Mhm. Okay.
So
So,
there's
and I'm guessing VFR conditions, not too much wind,
Yep,
stuff kind of like
all of those
those
things.
parameters.
And
Okay.
especially but the nice thing about Houston and the Gulf Coast area is there's a lot of military, um, operating areas that can, move you out of the weather if you need to,
Okay.
or sort of let you get your job done without sort of dealing too much with weather.
Mhm. So that you had a lot of flexibility then, having those different options so that you could get the job done as fast, well, in the best time frame as possible
Right.
rather than being constricted to one little area.
Right. But, but I'm tickled when you look at me and you say, "You could get this stuff done." Remember, this is
Yeah.
NASA and the NASA
This is a
pilot.
big organization.
Yes.
I mean, to be quite honest, I always wondered what what some of the operations actually happen in those military areas because you always learn about it as a pilot. But you're always like, "Huh, I wonder what what
Yeah.
they do in there."
Um, so yeah, and just to extend that discussion just a little bit, we have also had occasions where we've gone out for a full week of a flight campaign to Houston and never flown a single day. Bec
Wow.
because of the weather
Okay.
or because of, It could be operations things. It could be the
Right.
MOAs aren't available, or any of those kinds of things that can shut down a flight like that or any other flight. So this is it. It is not a guarantee.
Right. Everything has to be within the margins, the proper margins, otherwise it's
Yep.
not worth it.
Yep.
Hey, that's why those safety protocols are in place, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, as the first NASA-funded scientist to conduct your experiment in space, launched by a Blue Origin spacecraft, what was the journey to that milestone like? Because we've kind of like touched upon it overall. And then how did 8 years of persistence and belief culminate in that moment?
Yeah,
I'm asking big questions here.
but the fun thing to think about is that um, it's not like the last 10 years we're all focused on getting this thing done.
Right.
It's more like um, a career in science, working on space-related science activities, sort of naturally led a group of us to a set of opportunities that arose when the commercial spaceflight world began to come into effect and the amount of access to space began to increase. So it's almost like um, uh, well, we belong to a group of scientists called the National Suborbital Researchers Group, right?
Okay.
This group has been around for more than 10 years. All of us waiting for our turn to fly, all of us figuring that if we kept working in this area and advancing the cause of scientists in space, that eventually some of us would get to go. Um,
Hmm.
so was I lucky enough to go? Yeah, absolutely. Was it was it was it just me and us pointing to getting Rob into space? Not even close,
No.
right? It's more like um, all of the things we've done on the space shuttle and all the experiments that we've had and currently have on the space station all contribute to an ecosystem and sort of a philosophy, if not an actual activity, that basically is all pointed in a direction. And
Right.
eventually, that direction is going to have more and more students, as I mentioned earlier, finding their summer internship on a space
Hmm.
station or on the moon or something like that. I truly believe that's going to happen. So, getting back to trying to answer your question about perseverance and making it happen, um, it was just it was just one of those things where a whole group of us just kept working on the notion, got the funding in place, got the rocket in place, learned how to buy a seat for a scientist on a commercial space flight. It's not like you just put out a purchase
Right.
order for that.
Yeah,
You
because
know?
it wasn't a NASA flight, it was a Blue Origin flight.
Yeah, so somebody's got to put all that stuff together, and there's a lot of moving parts that came together. You used the word persistence.
Mhm.
I think I I almost prefer the term perseverance, and
Mhm.
um, there's a definition of perseverance that I like in particular, and then I think it applies to any of us that are learning to fly or getting a new rating or anything along these lines. Um, and it's from one of my favorite actors, Tom Hanks, who
Ooh.
hosted an HBO series called From the Earth to the Moon. But
Okay.
one of his quotes as he would introduce the various segments of this series was talking about the term perseverance. And his his definition of perseverance ran something like this. Perseverance is the wherewithal to solve the problems one by one over the long course of the endeavor. Now,
Hmm.
there's a lot of things that I like about that phraseology for perseverance. It's not like persistence, which is like a dog grabbing onto something and won't let go. It's not
Right.
like, "Oh my gosh, I'm barely holding on to a rope and I need to hold on because
Yeah.
there's glory at the end of that rope," or something like that. No, it's just that scientist, that engineer, that practical person that that dedicates solving this problem, and this
Mhm.
problem, and this problem, and this problem, and this problem, and this problem, and pretty soon you're pretty far down the road, and your perseverance has taken you to the point where you can ask the question what it's like to go to space. It's just sort of a
Mhm.
natural outcome as opposed to, a magical happening.
So basically, if to kind of recount what you just shared, is that instead of persistence of just holding on and like not letting go, rather it's more like one step in front of the other,
Yep,
not giving up on that path,
yep,
but moving one step at a time rather than just I will hold on to this for dear life and I will make it.
yep.
Is that a am I grasping that correctly?
You are, and it's not like it's not like there was ever a guarantee or even that was like the primary goal, but the
Mhm.
notion that you could continue to work towards something like that and persevere over the longer haul. I mean, imagine from the time we wrote the proposal till the time I flew was 10 years.
Wow.
Wrote the proposal,
Yeah.
got funded, then got sort of refunded over time in order to make it happen.
Yeah.
Had to develop all the protocols and procedures. Had to write the book basically on how to do this. Um, yeah.
I mean, that's a well, I was gonna ask you what because since it was such a long period, what some of the challenges that you had to work through that 10 years of going from the proposal to actually being up in the air, up in space. I'm sure there was many instances that it wasn't just smooth sailing, so what would be one of those moments?
Well, anybody that's flown almost any aircraft, anything, heck, anybody that's taken a commercial air flight knows that there are certain rules, certain places
Mhm.
where you can sit, certain times when you have to be seated. And
Mhm.
if I'm a scientist and I want to do something with with tools now inside there, okay, all of the rules have to be rethought. Can I carry them in? Am I allowed to carry them in?
Right.
Can I carry them on the gantry? Can I take them across the stairs? Maybe somebody else needs to take them in there so they're there when I walk in so that I don't have to. What happens if I were to drop something on the way up the ladder to the capsule? What happens if I get there and things aren't in the right place? So just simple
There's a
stuff.
lot of what ifs you just listed there.
Yeah,
That's a lot of things you have to think about just for those
right. Yeah, exactly.
3.5 minutes.
Right on. So a lot of that protocol was worked out over time in simulators, just like what we do when we
Yep.
learn how to fly or want to develop new things without actually being up in the air. We went out to the
Mhm.
Blue Origin simulator many times and worked out all these processes and procedures. Had them checked by the FAA that where they needed to be sure that, even they're not stupid things, but, what I take in there affects weight and balance. Where they
Right.
are affects, um, not only weight and balance per se, but depending upon where it is, it ends up deflecting where the capsule is eventually gonna land. So all of that stuff has to be
And if you
thought through.
move, it changes the center of gravity.
Yep. Yep. All those kinds of things had to be worked out. So I've sort of wandered around there, but that kind of answers your question on the things that we had to work on step by step until we got
Yeah.
the protocol that flight provider could sign off on as saying, yes, we can support this.
Mm-hmm.
FAA would say, yeah, you're not being stupid inside that spacecraft. And
So did
then,
the FAA and NASA have to sign off on a bunch of these things?
yep,
Okay.
yep.
Very
Now,
interesting.
I
How involved was the FAA with this?
I don't have a clear
Okay.
firsthand knowledge of that. But I do know that FAA inspectors were there during our training and um, saw all the things that I had inside the capsule to work on. So, I mean, they were involved, but
Interesting.
not firsthand knowledge for me.
Right. Okay. Well, I wouldn't have thought about the FAA being involved at all. So,
It's
but it's good to hear that both sides are working together because they do affect one another.
yeah.
Yeah. And then you said you had to keep it a secret from a lot of people. Who ended up being able to know this process was going on before the official announcement?
Uh, well, um, basically anybody that would sign the
An
non-disclosure
NDA?
agreements, right?
Yeah.
So my family knew, um, and the university knew because
Okay.
they had to arrange all of the
Right.
various things that you can think of that would allow one of their
Of
employees
course.
to do something like this.
Right.
Um, and we had a wonderful comms team, a wonderful communications team that documented the process and documented the flight. So they were in on it. Um, but yeah, that gives you some idea of what the sort of
Yeah.
people were like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it makes sense that the some people from the faculty would need to know because a professor suddenly not being around for certain periods of time would be a little bit suspicious.
It can happen, yeah.
But I'm guessing you were also teaching at the same time while doing this, am I correct, or
Not so much.
not so much?
Yep.
Okay.
Uh, I am basically a researcher now. Um,
Okay.
I I I teach our graduate students,
Mm,
graduate courses, but not classroom, um,
okay.
stuff.
Okay. Well, that's still very interesting and really, really great for those graduate students. They get an amazing teacher, I'm sure.
Well, they also get to they also get to be 1 degree of separation from the experience. They came out to the
Mhm.
launch, they supported the science, they participated in the experiments from the
Oh,
ground.
really?
Absolutely.
That's
Um,
amazing.
one of the things that we had to work out, backing up for just a second with the flight providers was, um, how to coordinate things on the ground with things inside the capsule. Um,
Right.
Normally, those communications go just from the Capcom, up to the people in the capsule and back down. They don't go sideways out to the payload lab where the other people were doing
Right.
things related to the experiment. So Blue Origin was great in sort of opening up their um, internal processes to be changed to
Mm,
the point where our teams could be on the communications loops and understand what was going on in real time.
that's an invaluable experience for
Yep,
those students and for yourself. Well,
yep, they were right
that's
there.
just amazing. I'm sure they were very excited to be part of something so unique and so such an experience that most people don't get to have. So, that's very cool. Well, we've talked about various different things, and you've kind of highlighted how the industry is changing, but I'd like to dig into it a little bit more, how the aerospace industry is is booming in many respects. We have SpaceX, we have Blue Origin. I mean, you even talked about satellites when you were a kid. A year ago or a couple of years ago, I remember seeing these dots in the sky, and it was a bunch of the SpaceX launches, and I actually had to look up. I'm like, what are those? I'm like,
Yep.
oh, they're satellites
Yep.
all getting launched in a row, so you could see a bunch of them going across the sky and stuff like that.
Pretty wild.
So
And that,
more launches. I saw even when I was in Florida as a flight student, I went to see a couple of the SpaceX launches. That was very unique. So they're happening more, and civilian access to space is increasing. We've seen some celebrities go up as
yep.
well.
Yep.
So, and then you at one point shared that SpaceX has a Starship potentially in the works as well. How do you see these various developments shaping the future for students, for civilians, for our culture and life as we move into a new era, basically?
Yeah. Just that's a wonderful, wonderful question. And I'll try to answer it in a couple of ways. But the first thing is that however, the why ever the commercial space is opening up with people like Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, SpaceX, Vast Aerospace. There's just a lot of people that are deeply, fundamentally interested in space and think that there is a business case for developing space. So many of the parallels are back towards the early days of aviation when
Hmm.
at first it was the government that had to sponsor, and there were a few rich people that got to do things, but eventually there became a business case for um, the airspace system and the commercial airways that we have now. We're at the front end of that, I think, and I don't think I'm exaggerating at all. I think we're at the front end of that with regard to space. Um, there's a lot of problems to be solved. There's a lot of stuff in
Mhm.
space. There's traffic management that has to go on, but the
Right.
amount of commercial interest in living and working in space, producing products in space, using space to look back at the Earth for all kinds of important decisions with regard to weather management, coastal management, crop
Right.
management, all those kinds of things. There are so many people, so many industries waiting, putting money into and building capacity for living and working in space. So I absolutely truly believe we are at the front end of what aviation was basically 100 years ago. Uh,
Mhm.
and that we will see more and more people in space, and we'll see more and more products that are made possible because of either research or manufacturing that was done in space. A lot of people believe that.
Well, what do you looking forward as with all of these things that you've just mentioned, what excites you the most with all of these things that are in development?
So there's absolutely no question what excites me most, and that is that people will get to have the experience. That there's
Mm.
interest, there's curiosity, there's excitement about going to space. And there's kids now that believe that they might have their turn, right?
Yeah,
Right? They might have
so
their
true.
and for all of these endeavors, for me personally, for all of us that have flown or learned to fly or have been in the
Mhm.
flight environment, it's the doing of that stuff is cool, yes, but the other thing is that it's because people are there doing it. It's the people that get to do it. It's the people that you get to learn from and share your experiences with that make the journey all that much more special. And that's why I think the the idea of developing robots and other things in space
Mhm.
and having robots do things in space and satellites doing their own things in space. Yeah, it's all cool. Fine, fine, fine. But what excites me is about people. going to space, about people experiencing space firsthand. And the more that we can share that, the more that we can get that out there, the more that we can get people excited in that wonderment of being in space, um, I think we're going to be better people in the world.
Yeah, I have to agree with that because it's a joy and excitement and adventure that you get to share with a community of people who also want that same thing. And that's just priceless in my mind
Yep.
anyways.
And so that's what excites me most. When you ask me about all the cool stuff going on,
Mhm.
rovers, yeah, all good, excellent, robots
But
cool and
the
everything, but
people are the real thing.
it's all about people sharing that journey in space.
Hey, well, I wouldn't have met you if I wasn't interested in aviation, didn't become a pilot myself, and then you also becoming a pilot and being an astronaut. This joy of aviation and aerospace is through people got us connected. So I am very
Absolutely.
thankful for the shared curiosity.
Yeah,
And you've
me
also
too.
mentioned you've emphasized persistence, perseverance, but we talked about persistence being different, but perseverance as key lessons from your career. Can you share a moment when those were tested and how pushing through and persevering shaped who you are today?
Yeah, and the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna avoid the question, all right?
Okay,
And the reason I'm gonna avoid the question a little bit, but then I will come back to it, is
fine
that
by me.
my definition of perseverance was all about solving problems one by one. And
Hmm,
so the n the notion that there would be a particularly difficult problem to be solved or something like that was, doesn't sort of fit
right.
my model of perseverance. But were there among the difficulties, um, I mean, imagine putting a year's worth of work into a proposal that doesn't get chosen, doesn't get funded.
Right.
We've experienced that. No, we've experienced that almost enough times that we understand that's part of the process. But again, I think those are among the more difficult things that you have to, quote, push through and just say, yep, this is
Mhm.
part of the process. I got to be better at this proposal. Got to learn more, got to write better, got to think up something more cool to do or something like that in order to make it happen. Uh,
Well, then to rephrase the question, because I like how you're going into this, is rather than making it a big problem, big thing, rather it's one step in front of the other, how do you how to help someone else who's facing failure, for example, how to change the mindset to this is a learning experience versus oh, I'm just bad, I can't do this kind of idea. Because I know I face this myself and then have to change the narrative. How have you quickly shaped that for yourself so that you don't get into that rut?
yeah, um, I, I wish I had a good answer for you, but the best thing I've got sort of two things. One that tugs back to my grandmother and what she would do if she didn't hit a good golf shot. She would just go down there and hit the next one. There's almost
Huh,
there's no memory.
yeah.
And I've heard that in the sports metaphor many times, and that is the best pitchers, the best hitters, the best ball strikers are the people that have no memory of the last one. Because if you remember
Hmm,
the one you missed, then that's in your head. And so
right.
you just forget about it. I I I I didn't miss any. I don't know. I'm just this is me. This is new. This is the next pitch. I'm going for it.
Here.
So that's sort of part number part number one. I think part number two and parallel number two is, I mean, just to get back to why we're here, think back to original flight training for your private license. How many things did you not know how to do? How many
It's a humbling
Yeah.
experience.
How many you want me to do what?
Everything was new. Everything
Yes.
was difficult.
Um, and yet with again, some perseverance, but also good mentorship, again, with the right
Mhm.
people, um, you begin to find out. And
Yeah, that
so nobody learns to fly in one lesson, and
no.
nobody, has I think this is a safe enough thing to say, nobody has never made a mistake learning to fly. Everybody makes a mistake. And in fact,
Yep.
if you don't, your instructor's probably gonna push it to the point where you do make one so that you can understand where your
Yeah.
edges are.
No, that's some really good points and a really good way to shape it. So then for young listeners who have been inspired by this conversation and your story and are eager to break into aviation or aerospace science, what advice would you give them to stay curious and navigate those challenges pursuing such an ambitious career?
Yeah, I think the answer goes back to, just anything a parent would tell your kid. Don't be afraid. Um,
Mm.
make mistakes, and by every stretch of the imagination, ask, talk, seek help, find mentorship, um, and fall forward, get up, and go some more. Um, it, it, I drop back to this again, but I absolutely remember how awkward it was the first couple flights I took to get my private.
Really?
Yeah, it's I I didn't know that you could actually touch the propeller.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
Hey, but I mean,
I don't
we
know.
all nobody knows until
Yeah,
you go into like you said, nobody knows how to be in a hangar until that first
yep,
flight, that first fam flight,
yep,
getting to talk with a flight instructor.
yep,
You don't know anything. So that's a very interesting I didn't think about that.
and we all have our limitations, and, again, I remember distinctly one of my first lessons, the instructor said, "Put the numbers right over the top of the cowling, and that's how you'll know that you're where you're supposed to be coming in
Mhm.
for a landing." I did that. I swear I did that, but nobody realized that I'm 4 inches taller than my instructor, all right? And
Seat adjustment.
so all of that stuff became, "Okay, now we're learning, now we're understanding, and we can again sort of get to the point where we solve the problems one by one over the long course of the
Mhm.
endeavor." Um, yeah,
So you had to definitely adjust your aiming point
I did.
according to your
I
specifications
learned.
versus your flight instructors. Hey, but that's why we make sure that our seat is in the right place for every single flight and we do our points according to our height, our seat adjustment
Yep,
because we're all different, but we can all learn that skill set.
yep.
Well, I really appreciate your time today. I have learned a lot from our conversation, and I really hope the Skyward's listeners have learned as well. But thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so very welcome. It's been a pleasure talking. It is always a pleasure to talk about these kinds of experiences for sure. But the other thing that happens when we get to talk, when we're enabled to talk like this, and thank you for
Mhm.
having me talk like this, is that when we have to verbalize stuff, we learn more about what our own feelings and experiences were like. So when I get a chance to talk to you like this, it helps me understand what went on. It helps me understand myself too.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure, and I'd be happy to have you on again.
Thank you very much.
That's a wrap for this incredible episode of Skyward. Dr. Rob Ferl's journey from a curious kid to the very first NASA-funded scientist conducting experiments in space is a testament to the power of perseverance and curiosity. To all listeners, let his story inspire you to chase your dreams in aviation or aerospace, one step at a time. Want to dive deeper? Check out Skyward's previous episodes on YouTube and all listening platforms. A huge thank you for supporting this podcast by liking, sharing, subscribing, and if you're looking for more, join the Skyward Patreon community. Every little support helps this podcast continue growing. Share your thoughts on this episode in the comments below or on X and TikTok with #SkywardPodcast. Until next time, keep looking skyward.